There were no survivors, not one. In a secret facility hidden in occupied Manchuria, operating for nearly a decade, surrounded by thousands of prisoners, not a single documented person who entered as a test subject is known to have walked out alive. The staff had a word for them. They called them logs, not patients, not prisoners. Logs, pieces of timber processed and discarded. This is Unit 731, and the most disturbing part of this story is not what happened inside that facility. It is what happened after the war ended, when the men responsible should have faced justice and instead walked free. My name is the voice behind creepy Chronicles, and every fact you're about to hear is drawn from declassified American military records, international war crimes trials, and decades of academic research that took nearly 50 years to become public knowledge. Before we go further, it helps to understand the historical moment that made something like Unit 731 possible. Japan had spent the early decades of the 20th century rapidly modernizing its military, drawing lessons from earlier conflicts about how disease, far more than direct combat, decided the outcome of prolonged wars. By the early 1930s, Japan had already invaded Manchuria in northeast China, installing a puppet state and stationing a powerful occupying army with virtually no outside oversight. It was, in the coldest possible sense, the perfect environment for a secret program that required total secrecy, an endless supply of prisoners, and a government willing to look away. Unit 731 began in the early 1930s as a Japanese Imperial Army program officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Officially, its purpose was to protect soldiers from disease. In reality, under the command of a microbiologist named Shiro Ishii, it became something else entirely. Ishii had read the 1925 Geneva Protocol banning biological and chemical weapons and concluded that anything the world's governments were frightened enough to ban must be extraordinarily effective. He pushed for funding. He got it. By 1936, he had a sprawling facility in the Pingfang district outside Harbin, China. Over 150 buildings, complete with laboratories, operating theaters, military barracks, and multiple cremation furnaces. The facility operated under a name designed to sound bureaucratic and harmless. To the outside world, it was a water purification research center. Inside its walls, it became one of the most extensively staffed and well-funded human experimentation programs the world has ever documented, employing several thousand personnel at its peak, including trained physicians, microbiologists, and military officers who had been specifically recruited from Japan's top medical institutions. What happened inside those buildings has been documented through surviving testimony, recovered records, and post-war investigations. Prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians, along with Russians, Koreans, and Allied prisoners of war, were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid to study how the diseases spread and progressed. Vivisection was performed on living conscious subjects without anesthesia because researchers believed anesthesia would alter the test results they were measuring. Limbs were repeatedly frozen and thawed to study frostbite, in some cases until the flesh separated from the bone while the victim remained alive and conscious. Women were forcibly impregnated specifically so researchers could study the effects of disease and trauma on pregnancy. Men infected with syphilis were ordered to rape other prisoners so doctors could trace exactly how the disease spread between bodies. Field tests took the horror beyond the facility walls entirely. Unit 731 personnel deliberately contaminated water supplies, food stores, and agricultural land across Chinese villages with plague-infected fleas and cholera bacteria. These attacks are estimated to have killed at least 200,000 people who were never inside the facility at all, civilians in towns and villages who had no idea what was being done to them. In total, historians estimate the facility itself killed at minimum several thousand people directly, with field operations responsible for vastly more. Some of the experimentation went beyond even battlefield medical research and into territory that served no military purpose whatsoever. Survivor testimony collected decades later described prisoners injected with horse urine, animal blood, and seawater purely to observe the physiological consequences. Children held at the facility were, according to multiple accounts, forced into sealed gas chambers so that researchers could time and document their convulsions as they died. None of this produced data with any conceivable medical or military application. It was cruelty conducted under the language of science. In 1939, during a border clash between Japanese and Soviet forces known as the Nomonhan Incident, Unit 731 conducted its first documented field operation, dumping intestinal typhoid bacteria into a river to try to disable the opposing Soviet army. The attack failed. The typhoid strain became ineffective almost immediately upon contact with the water, but it demonstrated that the unit's ambitions had moved well beyond the laboratory and into active warfare against entire populations. Japan surrendered in August 1945. In any conventional understanding of post-war justice, the leadership of Unit 731 should have stood beside the men tried at Nuremberg and in Tokyo. Doctors who experimented on living human beings without consent, who killed deliberately and methodically in the name of military research. That is precisely the category of crime the Allied war crimes tribunals were built to address. It did not happen. Justice was never served for the victims of Unit 731. In the autumn of 1945, a United States Army officer named Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders arrived in Japan to investigate rumors of a biological weapons program. Initially, the Japanese gave him almost nothing. Then Sanders made a threat. He told his Japanese contacts that if they did not cooperate, he would bring Soviet investigators into the matter instead. The following morning, Sanders received a detailed manuscript describing Japan's entire biological warfare program. Sanders took what he found to General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander overseeing the American occupation of Japan, and MacArthur made a decision that would remain hidden from the public for decades. He secretly granted full political immunity to Shiro Ishii and the senior scientists of Unit 731. In exchange, the doctors handed over their complete research files, pathology slides, autopsy reports, and detailed data drawn directly from human experimentation. The reasoning, as later confirmed in declassified American records, was straightforward and cold. The United States wanted exclusive access to research that could not ethically be replicated by American scientists themselves, and wanted to ensure the Soviet Union did not obtain that same data during the rapidly emerging Cold War. Historian Sheldon Harris later concluded that the actual research, when examined, was scientifically disappointing and added little genuine value to American programs that had already surpassed it. The immunity deal, in other words, may not even have purchased anything of real worth. It simply purchased silence. Declassified records uncovered decades later by Japanese historian Tsuneshi Keiichi revealed something even more troubling than the immunity arrangement itself. The American investigators did not simply receive this data freely. They paid for it, using a secret U.S. Army fund to compensate former Unit 731 doctors directly for their experimental results. Stipends were issued for years afterward. The American government did not merely overlook what had happened, it financially rewarded the men who had done it. The Soviet Union was the only government to formally prosecute anyone connected to Unit 731. In December 1949, 12 former physicians, officers and staff faced trial in Khabarovsk, accused of manufacturing and using biological weapons. American officials publicly dismissed the proceedings as a Soviet show trial, protecting their own secret arrangement. It is worth pausing on how strange that dismissal really was. The United States, which had spent years prosecuting Nazi doctors at Nuremberg for comparable crimes against humanity, chose to publicly discredit a foreign trial of men who had committed remarkably similar atrocities, not because the evidence against them was weak, but because acknowledging the trial's legitimacy risked exposing America's own secret arrangement with the very men being tried. Protected by that arrangement, many of Unit 731's senior doctors returned to prominent civilian careers. Some became professors at major universities. One rose to governor of Tokyo. Another became president of the Japanese Medical Association. Shiro Ishii himself returned quietly to private medical practice and died of throat cancer in 1959, never having faced trial for what the facility under his command had done. For decades, the Japanese government simply denied Unit 731 had ever existed in this form. Textbooks omitted it entirely. It was not until the 1980s, as aging veterans and former staff finally began speaking publicly, that the full scale of what had happened started to enter public record. One of those veterans, a man named Akira Shimizu, spent over 4 months at the facility as a young recruit before fleeing with retreating Japanese forces at the end of the war. He later said he initially believed he was being trained to prevent disease, only realizing afterward that he had been part of infecting and dissecting living people in the name of germ warfare. He was warned never to speak about what he had seen, and for more than 70 years, he did not. In 2002, a Tokyo district court formally acknowledged for the first time that the Japanese state bore direct responsibility for the biological attacks. Despite that acknowledgement, courts have continued to deny compensation claims from victims' families, citing legal doctrines of state immunity. One of the last surviving judges from the original Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, Bert Roling, wrote decades later that he found it a bitter experience to learn that crimes of this magnitude had been deliberately kept hidden from his own courtroom by the American government that he had served alongside. Today, the original Harbin complex stands preserved as a museum maintained by the Chinese government as a permanent record of what happened there. Visitors can walk through the remains of the same buildings where the experiments took place. Some sections of the site remain a subject of ongoing historical research, as researchers continue uncovering additional documentation buried in archives on multiple continents. Creepy Chronicles investigates the cases the official record would rather you found too uncomfortable to revisit. Every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, real, documented, told without apology. The men who ran Unit 731 killed thousands of people in the name of research. Then a government that fought a war partly to defeat exactly this kind of atrocity decided their data was worth more than their accountability. They called their victims logs. History almost let them get away with calling it nothing at all.